All right, it's time to talk a little USC and Stanford. I'm Ryan Abraham, publisher of USCFootball.com. We got RJ Abadia from thebootleg.com. What is up, RJ?
So much is up, and this game's always a big deal, I think, for both the fan bases, and once again, I think it's kind of a big deal for everybody. It gets that primetime 5:30 slot this week.
Yeah, it should be a good one. I thought Stanford was really impressive versus Rice. USC struggled a little bit with Western Michigan, but that is a team that won 13 games last year. So a lot of people looking at this game to answer some questions. You got a power from the north and a power from the south.
Yeah, and I've been following obviously your stellar daily reports from your beat writing crew down there, and I thought one of the most interesting things to come from this week was Dan Weber talking about how USC basically stayed in a nickel base for basically the whole game, much to its detriment. Now, I am of the opinion that is extremely unlikely to be a front that they show against Stanford, but I would definitely want to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, so last year, in the beginning of the year when USC struggled, they did mix it up a little bit where for Stanford, they had some kind of special packages where they would bring in some different formations and rotation of players. You didn't see most of the other time, kind of like a jumbo sort of front, or at least jumbo for what USC is doing. Their base defense, they call it like, their base defense is supposed to have 3 down linemen, but their base defense is really the nickel. Like, that's what they play most of the time. During the 9-game winning streak last year, they were in that, I think 93% of the time they were in nickel. It was the teams like Stanford and Utah, and I think in Alabama too, where they used more down linemen. Now, they didn't do that much against Western Michigan, and they were running the ball almost exclusively, so that was a little bit perplexing. Not exactly sure what's going on there, but Clancy Pendergast the defensive coordinator, likes to get speed out in the field. They put 3 wide receivers out there, so he's playing nickel. And so if Stanford really wants to do something, they could put 3 wide receivers out there, or 3 people wide, a couple tight ends, and they just pound the ball, and Clancy Pendergast will probably stay in the nickel, it seems. But it's really, they say it's about matchups, but I do expect them to have some different sort of fronts for Stanford, because they got pushed around too much against Western Michigan. You do that against Stanford, it's going to be a long evening.
So, and just one more follow-up just on that. Cameron Smith, I know, missed the first half, and Coach Helton talked about how just simple alignment was kind of a problem against Western Michigan. And I wonder, to what extent did his absence in the first half kind of exacerbate that? And then secondly, did you see some improvement when he returned in the second half?
Yeah, they really only gave up 1 defensive touchdown after he returned. And, they didn't want to throw Jordan Iosefa, who's the linebacker that came in the first half, under the bus or anything, but certainly the communication was a bit of a problem. Porter Gustin was talking about sometimes he was looking back to see the call and the play would start. So it definitely looked like there was some first game problems, and not having their captain out there, I think it hurt that a little bit. So, we'll see what happens in this one, but they need to clean a lot of stuff up. There was a lot of questions. We got the defensive players to talk yesterday, and Clancy Pendergast and stuff. So, I think they realized it was not the kind of effort that that's gonna get them a win against Stanford. And to me, I don't know, RJ, for you, what did you see when Stanford played Rice? Not a great opponent, whatever, thousands of miles away, but to me it looked like a even better team than I thought. Stanford was going to be good, but they looked even better than I thought.
Well, it's really interesting because the debate, I think, since that game has been exactly that, right? What can we take away from this game, given the opponent and kind of the circumstances under which the game was played? And I would say, yeah, you definitely have to add an asterisk for the opponent. However, the things that Stanford did well in that game, I expect them to be the things that Stanford does well for most of the season. I think the way they ran the ball behind that offensive line is going to be a strength, and I think it's going to be a situation where it gets better as the year goes on, because I think at some point Stanford's going to make a commitment to its two freshman offensive tackles, who I think are the most talented guys in that group. And then the other thing that stuck out, the other two things I would say the tight end group. I think Stanford's kind of always been known for having at least a good tight end, and they've got 4 this year. And
Wow.
I think that's going to be something that gives teams problems all season long. And then finally, I talked about the freshman tackles, but just David Shaw's willingness to put freshman talent on the field. Connor Weddington led the team in receptions in his first college game, and he's kind of been looking very unfreshman-like pretty much since we've been able to see him from the spring through the summer through now. So, I think every game is not going to look like 62-7, but I think what Stanford was able to do well in those games are the things it's going to be doing well in the games that it wins.
Yeah, the tight end group, and I think USC's got a really good group of tight ends, but you question how they use them sometimes. Stanford seems to be very good at utilizing the tight ends, and one of the guys that I really like, and I think he had a couple touchdowns, Colby Parkinson, watching him like at the opening and just going, man, that guy's going to kill it at Stanford. So the fact that he got 2 touchdowns in his first game, that makes me feel good about my prediction.
Yes, your eye remains as sharp as ever, Ryan. Nobody questions your eye for talent, and I'm sure Stanford fans are glad you were right.
But what did he like? I didn't get to watch it the most of the second half. Like, how did he look in the tight end group? Like, who kind of stood out?
So they actually all had catches, if not by the first quarter, I think by the first half. And so I think the pecking order is still pretty much the same. You've got Dalton Schultz, and the reason that he starts is not just because he's a senior, but because he's the best run blocking tight end, and that's, as you know, with Stanford, that's kind of where it all starts. But Caden Smith and Scooter Harrington played and caught passes and played well. And Colby Parkinson, as you can imagine, he's low man in terms of reliability, in terms of run blocking, but they've used him all over the place, and I'd expect them to use them a lot more, especially in those green zone, red zone situations where you can throw the ball up to a guy who is 6'7", 229, and athletic. I mean, that's a problem for a lot of defenses. And it actually, I'd like to ask you, because I was kind of speculating about it yesterday, how do you imagine, who gets that assignment for USC out of that nickel-based defense? The first name that came to my mind was Marvell Tell, but who do you expect USC to try to use personnel-wise to deal with that group?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because sometimes you'll have Uchenna Nwosu kind of dropping back because they don't want him really covering a slot receiver, but in this case you put 2 tight ends out there, he's probably going to be on one of them. When they have if they have a nickel, there's J.N.A. Harris is the guy that's kind of coming in there, but I like the way Marvell Tell would match up. I think he's probably would be the focus. I think he had a pick 6 in the game against Western Michigan. I think he's stepped up his game. I think they like the way he's playing. I think Chris Hawkins will be kind of more roaming a little bit, so you'll probably see Tell a little closer to the line of scrimmage, and you have to cover some guys like that. But that's always a challenge. It's just they cause these crazy matchup problems where you got these tall athletic tight ends, people cover them that are shorter or not as fast or things like that. So it can be a nightmarish matchup. And I think if it comes down to that, where Keller Chris has a ton of time and he can kind of pick his spots and find guys open, it's going to be hard to cover those guys for long periods of time. So it's going to be more about trying to get some sort of pass rush, disrupting the passing game a little bit, and not allowing Chris to have all the time in the world. And then one of those guys, one of those tight ends, or one of those receivers are going to be open. And if Chris can find them, then obviously that's going to be a successful day for the passing game.
So just before we leave the USC defense, Stanford offense comparison, let me ask you about that. Obviously, Stevie Tui Kolovatu, am I close
Very good
on that?
Yeah, you got it.
He was a big anchor for you guys last year in the literal and figurative sense of the word, and he's gone. And I'm just wondering the extent to which USC feels good about its depth and its starters on that defensive line. Who do you think are the guys that are going to have to get that push?
Yeah, he's one of the hardest guys to replace, and I think when you see the line kind of get pushed around a little bit on Saturday, they're like, okay, well, how much did they miss Stevie T? and they missed him a lot, So Josh Fatu, who was kind of a stopgap, he's a JC transfer that has come in. He got the start. Marlon Tuipulotu, who was committed to Washington, and USC ended up flipping him, and he became an early enrollee. Got a lot of reps behind him. I expect him to increase that role a little bit, but to ask like a true freshman to kind of fill those shoes, it's going to be difficult. I think he needs the kind of support around him. But, Stevie was a 25-year-old married man that was just a veteran presence on that line. And I think, some of the other veterans have kind of stepped up in their leadership roles, but someone's got to fill his actual shoes, that actual spot. I think the long term is probably going to be Marlon Tuipulotu. And they're kind of bringing him along somewhat slowly. But it's a key spot for USC. I think it's harder to run the defense that Clancy Pendergast likes to run if that guy's not doing a whole lot, maybe not collecting stats, but just, disrupting, taking up a couple of blockers, things like that. I think that's something that Stevie Tuipulotu did, allowing the guys around him to be successful. When that spot's kind of, not a strong point, then these other guys around him have to do more, and it's harder. And I think that you saw that happen against Western Michigan. So that's definitely an area to watch. I think the depth is pretty good behind him, but they don't play a lot of guys on the defensive line. They're mostly stick with the starters. Clancy Pendergast has more of an NFL mentality. I think they're going to try to do more rotation. They brought in like a Christian Rector on third downs in that spot. So third and longs, they would bring him in over Josh Fatu or Marlon Tuipulotu. And then sometimes, like you said, with 3 down linemen, they would bring in a Malik Dorton. But it was so infrequent that didn't need to rotate that spot as much. And so on the line, like maybe a Rasheem Green or someone like that, you could sub out for sometimes. But for the most part, he just likes to keep his starters in there until like the end of the game.
Yeah, it's funny just because, one of the things we heard while USC was under the crushing yoke of scholarship restrictions was that it was really hurting the defensive line not to be able to substitute. And now that they've got the option, it seems like Clancy Pendergast is just simply choosing not to do it.
Yeah, it is. And, we'll see if they change it, but his philosophy is more of like there's 2 guys with their hand on the ground, and so, like a quarterback spot, you could have a lot of depth at quarterback, but only one's playing. For Clancy, it's mostly been 2. Now they're bringing in more. They'll for the third down lineman, but you're talking about coming in for 14 plays a game or something. This is not like a substitution where you're spelling guys and here's the first line and they're going to send out a second wave. Like he doesn't really do that. And I think they have some of the bodies back there to do it. And we'll see if he trusts some of the younger players like going forward, if they're able to do that. But I don't know. What about Stanford defensively, RJ? I mean, everyone hears about the secondary. I know some guys came back from injury. Maybe not the best test against Rice, but this could arguably be one of the best secondaries in the Pac-12 or in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think the common assumption is always right that you want to be stronger the closer you are to the line of scrimmage. I mean, that's kind of been conventional football wisdom forever. And Stanford, in a way, is kind of inverted. And normally that might be a problem, but I think in today's era with the way football is played, it's kind of important to have a secondary like that. And yeah, I think that, obviously you knock on wood with health concerns, especially when you look at last year, but this could and should be the best secondary group that Stanford's ever have, stretching into the nickel coverage, stretching into dime situations. When you talk about safeties, Justin Reed and Brandon Simmons. And then on the corners, you've got Elijah Holder and Quentin Meeks. And backing them up, you got guys like Malik Antoine, Alameen Murphy. Terrence Alexander, who was one of those guys, is actually going to be out for this game. So I think for Stanford, if it comes down to a defensive group, I think Stanford wants it to come down to how well the secondary plays. I think the area of concern is kind of the area we were just talking about with USC, and that's the defensive line, where Harrison Phillips is certainly a known quantity, but after that, you'd be hard-pressed to find a name where you're really confident you're going to get something substantial out of that guy.
Yeah, I was kind of looking through and names that I would recognize, and I didn't know too much about the rest of the defensive line. Phillips for sure. What about the linebacking core? Like the front seven in general, because USC had more success running the football than throwing the football. Don't know what they're going to do in this game, but if that could be one of the focuses.
Yeah, well, I think that the linebackers are literally in between the defensive line and the secondary. I don't think they're quite as talented overall, but it's a really good and strong group. And one of the things they've been able to do finally is pare down the inside linebacker rotation. Last year, they literally rotated 6 guys at inside linebacker regularly. And it was, to their own admission, it was not by design. It was basically a function of, no 2 guys kind of stepping up and taking that role. And that's kind of changed this year. Bobby Okereke and Sean Barton are going to start at inside linebacker, and the coaches really like both of those guys. And then you've got Joey Alfieri, who moved from the outside to the inside. So now you've kind of got a more manageable 3-man rotation for 2 inside linebacker spots. And then on the outside, you have Peter Colombai, who I think Coach Helton remarked seemed like he's been here for years and years and years. And yeah, he's definitely been around for quite a while. But he's on the outside. And then on the other side, you've got Mike Tyler, who's a player who's been really kind of up and coming this past year, and he missed the Rice game, but he will be back on Saturday.
Well, any kind of questions about the USC offense you want to throw?
So, yeah, a couple things. First off, because I have virtually no social life at this point, I've been charting.
Sure.
I charted some of USC's plays against Western Michigan, and I basically got through the second and third quarters. So that's a stretch of 36 plays. And out of those 36 plays, USC was in the same personnel group for 33 of them. And that was the 1 back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receiver set. I mean, that was basically it. And there wasn't a lot of substitutions. I think there was some tight end substitutions because I think Petit got hurt a little bit. But my question is that essentially the norm? Because they were even using that group in goal line situations. Do you expect there to be a little bit more diversity there in the personnel, or is that pretty much what USC wants to do?
That's kind of like their base offense for the most part. I mean, they announced like a fullback as a starter, and then hardly ever gets into the game. They were rotating. So they were starting 3 wide receivers. Deontay Burnett was like the star of the Rose Bowl. He'll be their number 1 guy. But they brought Stephen Mitchell in. He was one of the starters, and Jalen Green. Stephen Mitchell's coming off a couple knee surgeries, and Jalen Green's a converted quarterback. But they're veterans, and I think the coaches feel more comfortable with them. But I expect to see a lot more of Tyler Vaughns, who was a former 5-star wide receiver that redshirted last year, and then Joseph Lewis, who's a true freshman 5-star wide receiver. That Clay Helton told us is going to get more playing time. So I think those 2 are going to be eventually the guys like next to Deontay Burnett, but they do like those formations. Now, sometimes they'll bring in an extra wide receiver. I don't think we saw that, like a 4 wide receiver set against Western Michigan. They would bring in, so Tyler Petit was like the starter. Daniel Metor-Bebe at tight end is their best tight end. He's, coming back from injury, so they've kind of brought him back slowly. I expect them to play more against Stanford. He's their biggest threat. But they would bring in Kerry Angeline and there was I forget who was the other tight end. So they would bring in like a 2 tight end set, but Kerry Angeline would come in with that group, and then that was kind of a unique thing that they would use every once in a while. So it's, for the most part, I would say that's kind of like the formation of choice. I don't know if it's going to be like a, mix things up or whatever with, because it's Stanford or things like that. But they do like that set. They have a lot of wide receivers. So I think because of that, they want to use the different formations where, you have that many wide receivers. I'm sorry, Josh Follow was the other. He's the true freshman tight end. He's a name I was blanking on. Sorry about that. But they would bring those guys in kind of as a package, and then they would, rotate in running backs. For the most part, 1 running back. They might use a little bit of 2 running backs, but that's mostly what they've been doing.
And it certainly looked to the casual observer against Western Michigan that the only thing that was stopping the USC running game was USC not running. Is it safe to say that Ronald Jones is probably locked in for more than the 18 carries he got on Saturday?
I don't know if it's safe to say that. I mean, they do like rotating. You would think that would be your best shot, right? Like he's the, one of the best players out there and looked really incredible. Now, Stephen Carr coming in, he had a couple touchdowns as a true freshman in his very first game. So similar to Colby Parkinson, get a couple touchdowns in your first ever game. That's pretty cool. I think they're going to use him a little bit more. They're going to use Ronald Jones on some kickoffs. So I don't know. I mean, I put the over-under at 20. I wouldn't think it's going to go a lot more than 18. I don't think they wanted him to have even 18 versus Western Michigan because, they thought that they would get all these other guys in. But some of the other running backs didn't get as many turns. They have a new running back coach in Dylan McCullough, so you're not really sure what the rotation is going to be. I think for your best chance to win, get him more than 20 carries. Will they? I'm not sure, RJ.
And that brings us, of course, to old Super Sam. And I guess when the bar is set as high as he set it last year, it's easy to kind of nitpick. But, Dan Weber, I saw the video that you guys ran a couple days ago. He kind of pointed out that when you really look at it, that performance really wasn't that bad or far off from what he typically does. I mean, you had the interceptions. Both of them were off deflections. I would say one of them was really kind of a tough luck situation, but how did he look to you?
Yeah, it wasn't. I think it was all right. Like he said afterwards too, like, it wasn't as bad as he thought it was. Sam Darnold said he wasn't as bad as he thought it was when he came off the field. That it was, he looked at the film and it was like, yeah, he was efficient. He probably had 4 drops. He would have had like maybe 6 incompletions or something if the balls weren't dropped. So a whole bunch of new wide receivers. I think they were trying to force some stuff every once in a while where it's like, hey, we can do what we want to in this opponent as opposed to just let the passing game come naturally. Like, okay, Ronald Jones is running like crazy. Just keep running them until they stop it, and then you'll open up some passing stuff. I think they tried to okay, we need to get some passing completions now, and then it wasn't happening, and then you kind of get some 3-and-outs, and it just wasn't working. But once they started finding Deontay Burnett, which they didn't want to be one-dimensional as far as like receivers, but that's pretty much what they ended up being. They need other people to kind of emerge and step up, and that can't just be something that you force feed to Sam Darnold. So he was, he wasn't like what he was in the Rose Bowl or anything. I don't think they really needed him to be. But that's the first time he hadn't thrown a touchdown pass since his first start against Utah. The rest of the way, he had at least 2. So I kind of expect them to, get going again a little bit more. But it's really more about the wide receivers. And I think if he gets Daniel Imatorbhebhe back at tight end, like as a more constant presence in the lineup, that should help him tremendously.
Yeah, and my understanding, and just from the opportunities I've had to watch Darnold, that's supposed to be what he changed to the USC passing game, right? I mean, there have been these years where the passing game is literally defined by that one outstanding receiver, and that's kind of the MO. And this year it sounds like, number one, he is more of a guy who is going to spread the ball around if given the opportunity. And number two, he's got a group of guys potentially that can do that.
Yeah, that was, I think with like Cody Kessler and some of the other quarterbacks and maybe some of just the way the plays were called, that's, they would always kind of find that one guy and force feed him. I don't think they had to do that. It was more of that was a choice. Now, if Deontay Burnett's the only guy getting separation and he's the only guy open, and you got to feed it to him, then you got to. But I think that's something that Sam Darnold likes to do. He does like to spread things around. It wasn't like Deontay Burnett was the starter coming into when Stephen Mitchell got hurt, he was in there more and more. Then you're like, hey man, this guy's really good. So you kind of find them. They wanted to give these guys opportunities. Some of the guys, some of the starters weren't getting a lot of separation, and I think that, kind of forced Sam Darnold's hand a little bit. So I think it's up to the receivers too. It's not just like, hey, I'm going to throw it to other guys. Well, if the one guy's clearly open, the other guys aren't, then it's probably stupid to throw to the other guys.
Yeah, and so let me just ask you this, because I think I know your answer, but it certainly seems like one of the things that causes a lot of consternation every year is that the Pac-12 insists on slotting this game so early when it tends to have some pretty significant ramifications in both divisions. But I think the flip side is that both of these teams are getting each other at a time when you might rather play them, because I think both of these teams are going to get much better as the year goes on. Is that your assessment in terms of, risk reward versus playing this game so early?
Yeah, I don't have a huge issue with it. I mean, I get that, all the California teams want to play each other. Stanford and USC want to play Notre Dame. And I think the Pac-12, there's some incompetence sometimes when they're doing the scheduling, and they can, I'm sure there's other better things they can do. The team's not, can a team go a whole year without a bye week, stuff like that, whatever. But for me, it's like there's no preseason in college football. And even though this is a big, conference matchup, it is still a matchup of teams in different divisions. And either team can lose this game and go on and win their division and win the Pac-12. So I don't see it as too big of a detriment. I don't mind having these early ones. I'd rather see this than, like an Alabama play a Nicholls State or something like that. So I kind of I don't know. Do you have any strong feelings towards it?
I think I agree pretty much with what you're saying. I think, first of all, I actually asked David Shaw about it, because it's a guarantee that kind of has implications in terms of the difficulty of your schedule every year when you're committed to playing USC and the rest of your division is getting them on a rotating basis. But he had literally no hesitation. In fact, he went so far as to say that there's not any point to being in the Pac-12 if Stanford and USC, aren't going to play each other as well as the California schools. And he didn't have any problem with it being pushed up. I kind of side with you. I think they can find a way to play this game later. I know the Notre Dame thing kind of throws a monkey wrench into the machinery for the conference, but that's a good monkey wrench. Notre Dame is a game that is a guaranteed draw for your conference. It's guaranteed national exposure. Stop treating it like it's a problem or an annoyance that Stanford and USC are playing them every single year and
right.
Getting great ratings.
Yes. It's that's not a problem. That's
yeah.
You figure this out. That's not, I'm sure it doesn't help, Washington women's soccer, but this is a good thing for the conference. So just deal with it and make it work, guys.
Yeah, no, I agree. So let's kind of get to predictions. I think I'm not too crazy about predicting results, but I want to know just how do you see this game playing? Do you think the offenses are going to have their way, or do you think there might be some defensive surprises? What are you expecting on Saturday?
Man, I do our Pac-12 podcast. I mean, I really wouldn't be shocked if Stanford won by a couple of touchdowns, if USC won by a couple of touchdowns, if it was close. There's just so much that can happen here. And we have, Stanford was a couple weeks ago, and that was in Australia. What are you really getting from that? I think USC is going to look fairly different than what they looked in week one. And I'm curious to see what Western Michigan looked like going forward, because PJ Fleck is gone, and they didn't really have a passing game, but they had a lot of guys back on defense. They had offensive linemen. It's going to be like a top 10 pick. It's like a good offensive line and some good running backs. I think that's actually going to be a pretty good team. I talked to some people that said, I don't think they will be, but my thought is Western Michigan is going to be pretty good. Still didn't think USC played very well, and think they're kind of capable of playing a lot better in this one. I think that the point spread's crazy. It's way too much, but whatever. I would take Stanford in the points. My gut says it's probably USC is going to win a close one, but it could come down to USC's had field goal problems and Stanford doesn't. So that they could win a close one there. That's kind of like my gut feeling says, but I feel like it's going to be something in the 30s where there'll be some offensive success, some defensive success, but nothing so one-sided where it was all offense or all defense or anything like that. How about you, RJ?
Yeah, I think you said it. I mean, this early in the year with the kind of talent that these teams are putting out there, I think any result is fairly plausible. I would expect that if Keller Christ plays well, which, when you compare the two quarterbacks, I think he's certainly on the undercard. But if he plays well, I think Stanford can win the game and probably should win the game, because if he's playing well, it probably means they're running the ball and he's getting things done with play action. If he doesn't play well, I'm not sure how Stanford can keep the game close, to be quite honest with you. But yeah, honestly, any outcome would be plausible in my mind. And Stanford in the points, to me, is a smart bet, I think, if you had to make a bet, because I think that's just all about USC bettors moving that money line, because I don't think anybody just on the surface sees this as a double-digit game walking in.
No, I don't. And I think, what was it? Our buddy Chris Felica, so he does, College Game Day and does a lot of picks. He said in the last 6 years, Stanford's been a dog of at least a touchdown 3 times versus USC and won 3 outright by at least 7 points. So, I mean, historically, it's just like, yeah, okay, maybe USC wins by 10 or something, but I would, 10 times out of 10, I would be taking Stanford in the points, and you kind of see how things develop from there. But to me, that's like, yeah, that would be where the smart money is. But the lines moved so much. I think it was up to 10 at some point. It was down at 4 after USC struggled with Western Michigan, and then it went back up, from 4 up to like 7. So, people are betting on USC, but I don't know. We'll see what happens.
All right. Well, I think it's going to be great. I'm excited. One last thing I guess we have to talk about. Are we going to get that Arizona-like heat that drenched that overwhelmed the Coliseum? Are there any other biblical plagues on the horizon for Saturday, weather-wise?
Any frogs or anything? No, I think
yeah.
Frogs falling from the sky. No, it's cooled down here significantly. I haven't actually checked the weather specifically for that day, but it's a lot more manageable. It's a lot better right now. Plus, it'll be a little bit later in the evening than that 2:15 start for Western Michigan. So hopefully, RJ, when you come down or when you're in the Coliseum, it's not going to be sweating bullets and anything like that. So that was pretty miserable. And I was in the press box, so my poor Shotgun and Keeley were down on the field shooting photos and video and stuff. I felt bad for them because they were really miserable.
Yeah, felt bad from the press box, right?
Well, it's not like it's an air conditioning press box. Like, it was still hot. Like, we were still sweating in there and the windows were open and stuff, but it's not baking in the sun. So you don't want to complain too much. I hear you. Yeah. Cool. Awesome stuff, RJ. We'll see you on Saturday. And it's good talking some USC Stanford football with you.
Yeah, thanks for doing it, Ryan. I'll see you on Saturday.
All right. Thanks, RJ. Hey, everyone. Thanks.